Continuing on with Chapter 16, we're looking at the South and the slavery controversy between 1793 and 1860. Now, what else when looking at slavery from a human perspective? Obviously, it's impossible to say here's what life as a slave was like, because life as a slave differed from master to master, from region to region, from state to state. So it's very difficult to say that. But overall, there are some commonalities. Obviously, working from dawn to dusk, very, very few rights to protect them. There was some protection from extreme punishment or death, but once again, African Americans, it is illegal for them to testify against any white person. And what all-white jury is going to convict a white man for killing a black man? We also see, for African Americans, no legally recognized marriages. So even though there were marriages, but these were more an informal thing as opposed to legally recognized. Jumping the broom actually comes from this era as a way that slaves could recognize through a symbolic means of joining together either for life or as long as they are not separated by being sold. Now, when looking at life as a slave, there is a real lack of a wage incentive. You know, workers today, we work really hard because we make money doing it. That's obviously not true for a slave because there really isn't a wage incentive. And so we see a structure in southern plantation societies from obviously the white owner on large plantations. There were white overseers and even in some cases black drivers, as they were called, that would help make up for this wage incentive using violence, using the whip to force African Americans to do the job that they wanted them to do. And while violence isn't necessarily an everyday occurrence, the threat of it always being there is enough to keep the society running and this economic system running, because the threat is just as powerful of being beaten with a whip. Now, the Deep South, or the Black Belt as it was called, in many of these states, if they weren't the majority of the population, they were near the majority of the population. So in this area, they were somewhat more able to retain their cultural and family ties because they were less likely to be sold to the Deep South, because guess what? They were already in the Deep South. And remember, that Second Great Awakening was focusing on bringing religion back to the people. And African Americans were a large focus of this Second Great Awakening of bringing religion. This is once again the African American Christianity is more of a syncretic religion, still combining Christianity with some of their African traditions that had been brought over by their ancestors. For example, that call and response between the preacher and the congregation that we still see in black churches today has its roots back in the era of slavery. And we'll talk about this later too, but also going along with Christianity, many slave owners actually advocated for their slaves to convert to Christianity because this is just one more way to control the population. Looking at the Old Testament particularly, there is a strong message that slaves should obey their master. And so this was heavily focused on the slave population to obey your master because it's the Christian thing to do. And someday you will reap your rewards, but not until you get to heaven. Now, control of the slave society in the South is going to be very strong, and there is a real crackdown against African Americans in the South, particularly when it comes to reading and writing. It is illegal for slaves to be able to read and write, and it's illegal to teach your slave to read and write for several reasons. And in fact, there's a 90% illiteracy rate by the time of the Civil War. And one of the major reasons for why this is true is because the only way rebellions could have worked among the slaves was to get the message out across the plantations. You know, just one plantation rising up isn't going to change anything in Southern society. But a massive rebellion across several towns across the state could possibly have a real impact. But that's not going to happen if there's not the ability to communicate. Because remember, they are very, very spread out in a plantation society. So this is one of the major ways to stop this rebellion. So what slaves did was rebel in smaller ways on a more day-to-day basis. You know, it doesn't have to be taking up a gun or a hammer or an axe or whatever to be a rebellion. It can be in smaller ways that can have more of an impact. Slowing down the work pace, stealing food, sabotaging equipment, and in some cases even running away as a way to show the master who is actually in charge at this plantation, or asserting themselves in some small way. So this was more of the common way that rebellions occurred on a day-to-day basis. But there are some examples, very few examples, of armed rebellion, and this is what absolutely scared the ever-loving heck out of white society in the South and prompted so many laws to be passed, was this constant fear of slave rebellions, especially in the states where slaves outnumbered white people. One of the first major ones was Gabriel Prosser in 1800 in Virginia. This never actually occurred. Gabriel's rebellion was still in its planning stages when white society in Virginia found out and hung the leaders, including obviously Gabriel Prosser. So this is step one. They hung the offenders as a way to say, don't ever do this again. We see another attempted rebellion as led by Denmark Vesey in 1822, Charleston, South Carolina. Had this gone through, and once again, this also did not happen because it was found out in advance, but had this gone through, this would have been the largest slave rebellion because 131 people were charged with conspiracy to kill their masters. There was massive amounts of African Americans in on the plan. The goal had been by Denmark Vesey to rise up to take control of Charleston, and then everyone escaped to Haiti, because remember, Haiti had recently had a successful slave rebellion and was now a free country. As a warning to the rest of the slaves in South Carolina, 35 of the ringleaders were hung in Denmark Vesey's attempted rebellion. And then last but not least is Nat Turner in 1831, Virginia. This one actually did occur. 50 slaves going from house to house, freeing the slaves in that house and killing every white person they saw on the way. 55 white people were eventually killed during Nat Turner's rebellion until the militia was called in to put down Nat Turner and his followers. This event, and while 55 white people dead isn't really that big in the grand scheme of things, this absolutely is going to have a major effect on society because of the fear that it inspired among white society in the South. Whether you owned slaves or not, it didn't matter. You were still a target to the slave. And so this is going to really prompt a harsher treatment against slaves, and there's not really much discussion of abolitionism in the South after Nat Turner's rebellion. Where we do see a discussion about abolitionism, and if you're not familiar with this, this is to abolish slavery, or to abolish that peculiar institution, as slavery was oftentimes called, because it's peculiar to have slavery in a country that calls itself free, where every man is created equal and people participate in the government. So you'll see peculiar institution. That's referring to slavery. But abolitionism really started, once again, with that idealism during the Revolutionary War. All men are created equal. And we already talked about some slave owners had freed their slaves. We see moving beyond that the creation of the American Colonization Society, founded in 1817. This is a Back to Africa movement. The goal of the American Colonization Society was to end slavery, but they didn't really want the freed slaves living amongst themselves. They wanted to ship them back to Africa. And in fact, the Republic of Liberia was actually founded as this Back to Africa movement. This was founded by 15,000 former American slaves who had been sent back to Africa. But here's the major issue with this Back to Africa movement. These are Americans. They've been Americanized. It's not so easy to go back to Africa where they don't know the language or the traditions or the customs or anything else. So this really isn't that viable of an option. But it shows you that even among the abolitionist segment of the American population, there is still this resentment against African Americans. We don't like slavery, but we also don't like black people as well. So let's ship them back to Africa, being the focus here. But where we really start to see an expansion of abolitionism is during that Second Great Awakening. This is another one of those reform movements. If we're going to create a perfect Christian kingdom, slavery has no part in it. So we do see these abolitionists, as led by Theodore Dwight Weld, advocating for an end to slavery because of the religious aspect. Theodore Dwight Weld, working at Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, launched this major anti-slavery movement, taking his sermon on the road, him and his followers, the Lane Rebels as they were called, saying how terrible slavery was from a Christian perspective. And this is one guy that actually helped to influence Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Here you see a common pamphlet trying to appeal to people's senses that slaves are human beings and not just property. Now, the reality among the American population was that there was a very, very small segment of the population who engaged in radical abolitionism, crazy anti-slavery advocates. This by no means is the majority of the population, and in fact, most white people thought these people were literally insane. But they do promote this idea that slavery is wrong. People like William Lloyd Garrison, probably one of the most famous abolitionists of the day. He was the editor of an anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, very militant, promoting the end to slavery. We also see the creation in 1833 of the American Anti-Slavery Society, partly by William Lloyd Garrison, along with these other people. Wendell Phillips, he advocated that nobody should eat sugar or wear cotton clothes based on the fact that it came from a slave society. David Walker, he was a black member of the American Anti-Slavery Society, very militant, and wanted to end white supremacy. He felt that whites and blacks should be equal. Sojourner Truth, once again, she was an African American and also advocated for women's rights too. There is a link between abolitionism and the women's rights movement, in part because why should one group get rights and not the other? And then also Martin Delany. He was an African American who advocated for recolonization or back to Africa. And then last but not least, probably another one of the most famous, was Frederick Douglass. He was a runaway slave, and he made a name for himself as being a very great orator, speaking out against slavery, and also a writer during this time. And he said the Constitution was a, quote, covenant with death and an agreement with hell because it had allowed slavery to form. And so this abolitionist reform movement really starts to take on steam when it starts impacting political parties. So abolitionists in the 1840s backed the Liberty Party, a small third-party group. In 1848, they backed the Free Soil Party, another small third-party group, which we'll talk about later. And then in the 1850s, the Republican Party, which obviously gained a lot more prominence during the Civil War. Here is a picture of William Lloyd Garrison and Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. Here you see two depictions, and this is really important from a pro-slavery perspective. Many whites in the South said there's nothing wrong with slavery, and in fact, it's a great thing simply because we provide for our slaves. They are like family to us, you know, and when they get elderly, we don't kick them out of our homes. We still care for them, even if they can't work the fields or do whatnot. We are like a family. Compare that to those poor wage slaves up north who, if they can't work, they starve to death. So from a white pro-slavery perspective, slavery is a great thing because what's the alternative? The wage slaves that we see in the north. So really after that Turner Rebellion in 1831, any sort of anti-slavery movement in the South really stops. People aren't really advocating for an end to slavery in the South anymore. And this pro-slavery movement began to defend its peculiar institution, like I said before, that slavery is a good thing because we take care of them. They're like our family, as opposed to those northern wage slaves who, if they can't work in the factories, they're just, you know, sorry for your luck. And in 1836, we see the Gag Resolution. Now, this is on a national level. In the House of Representatives, the members of the Southern delegation were sick and tired of hearing these abolitionist petitions to bring about an end to slavery. And so these Southern congressmen pushed through, or tried to push through, I should say, this Gag Resolution, that any future anti-slavery proposed legislation needed to be tabled without any discussion, meaning if a congressman were to bring forward a piece of legislation about how bad slavery was, it couldn't even be talked about. A gag was put, the quote-unquote gag was put in his mouth to stop the discussion. Now, John Quincy Adams, former president, now a representative at this time, really tried to bring an end to this gag resolution. He said, "This is a major violation of my right to petition the government, that freedom of speech and whatnot." But this gag resolution, way back in 1836, starts to show you how the division is growing between the North and the South. That Southern representatives don't even want to hear any sort of proposed legislation if it pertains to anti-slavery. Now, looking at slavery from a Northerner's perspective. Like I said, William Lloyd Garrison is extremely radical, and many Northerners are turned off by how radical William Lloyd Garrison is. Most of them felt that that slavery was a bargain that we had made in the Constitution. I might not be happy with it, I might not benefit from it even, but it is a bargain that we made, so it's here to stay. Quit crying about it. And like I said, the North is tied to the South economically. So even though Northerners aren't owning slaves anymore, they still benefit from the cotton that is coming out of the South in their textile mills. Also, Northern banks are depositing Southern money that's being made off the backs of slaves. So the majority of the white Northern society says slavery is here to stay, get over it. And in fact, we see mobs attacking abolitionists because they are seen as radical. Garrison himself was dragged through the streets of Boston by an angry mob. Another abolitionist, Elijah Lovejoy, was actually murdered in 1837 and his printing press destroyed for writing about the evils of slavery. But there is a growing number, and once again, this is one of those change over time thing, that as time progresses, more and more people start to see slavery as an evil, and we'll talk about this as the chapters progress. But instead of promoting abolition, which means get rid of slavery everywhere, most people recognize that slavery where it currently exists can't be stopped. It's there to stay. There was never a question whether or not to get rid of slavery in South Carolina. It was there already. Too bad. But maybe we can stop the spread of slavery into the territories or into the new states. This is the policy of the free soilers. It's kind of a more moderate position to take. And this is really going to be the focus as we move towards the Civil War. Not about getting rid of slavery where it exists, but stopping the spread of it into the new territories. And that is chapter 16.